Wow, yeah. Here comes another one. Oh, there it is.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. A couple of weeks ago, I had a chance to listen to bats. Now, I know what you're thinking. You can't actually hear them, right? The sounds they make are in a frequency too high for people to hear. Well, that's true, but there's an app for that. What if you had a special microphone designed to pick up ultrasonic frequencies? And what if you ran it through an iPad that played back the sounds at a lower pitch so that you could hear it? And what if that computer analyzed the sounds and even told you what kind of bat was doing it? Well, there is. And I got to watch it in action a couple of weeks ago when the Penobscot Valley chapter of Maine Audubon invited two biologists from the University of Maine to come tell us about bats and then demonstrate the program. And I never expected this. The sounds bats make while hunting and flying about the night sky are unlike anything I imagined. Get ready. We're going bats this morning. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Bar Harbor Whale Watch, Napa Auto Parts, EBS, and a Supercuts location near you. This is Maine. We have abundant wildlife. We love our fish, birds, mammals, all mammals, except maybe bats. The idea of a critter that looks like a flying mouse that only comes out at night and otherwise roosts in your attic is kind of creepy. Over the centuries, bats have gotten a bad rap. Vampires turn into bats. Bats have sharp teeth and carry disease. They fly under your hair. Some of that isn't really true, except maybe the vampire part. Bats are actually vital to the economy. They're vital to the ecosystem. They control pests and can eat up their own weight in insects and moths in one night. You know, most of the bad bugs wait until after dark to go out and spread mischief. If not for bats, we'd have a lot more pests. They wolf down mosquitoes around your house all night. Their echolocation is so acute, they can pick up the sound waves reflected back to them from the tiniest of insects. The problem is, they're dying off. A fungus from Europe somehow ended up over here. European bats have immunity. They've lived with them for a long time. Ours don't. And something called white nose syndrome has sent bat populations into a nosedive. Until this started happening, we didn't study bats much. We had plenty of them, and nobody really bothered. That has all changed. Dr. Eric Blomberg is a population ecologist at the University of Maine. He and Sabrina Moreno are going to demonstrate this new equipment a little bit later in the show. But first, we've got to learn some basics about bats. I'm just going to hit the highlights of Dr. Blomberg's presentation.
So I usually start off by just taking us through the annual life cycle of a bat. So the bats that we have here in Maine this time of year, it's the summertime. They're using our forested landscapes of the state. Eventually, they are going to move out of some of those landscapes and make some sort of a seasonal movement, which normally happens in August or September, early fall. And they're going to move towards the place where they're going to spend the winter, and that's going to come in one of two forms. They're either going to hibernate during the winter, so go into a long-term sleep where they lower their metabolic rate and their body temperature and whatnot, or they're going to migrate to more southern, warmer latitudes. And we'll talk about which species do those two things. Mating is occurring at that time, so they're breeding in the fall just before they go into hibernation. They'll spend the winter, again, either hibernating or in the southern U.S., and then they travel back into our Maine forests in the springtime. And during the late spring and summer is when they're going to be raising their young, and that's when we're mostly going to encounter them here. Most bats fit this sort of general life history strategy, so they have a very long lifespan. There have been recently little brown bats that have been banded, and so we know how old they are, and they've been recovered at 32 or 33 years old, so they can live a very long time, which you might not expect for something that's roughly the size of a mouse. We normally think of small mammals as being very short-lived. They only have one offspring per year.
One baby per year. But this is interesting. For many species, all the mothers come together to give birth, and then they group their babies into a nursery. So if you ever get a chance to look inside, you might see a whole bunch of tiny, ugly babies. Well, not that tiny. Another weird thing is that the babies are huge at birth, up to a third the size of the mother. And humans, that would be like giving birth to a 35-pound baby.
And the young, because they're born fairly large, they grow fairly quickly, and they're actually capable of flying and leaving these maternity colonies at about a month to 6 weeks of age. So very rapid growth. The males are deadbeat dads. They play basically no role in the reproduction outside of fertilization. So we have females using maternity colonies and males just sort of off doing their own thing in the summertime. Bats are important for a whole bunch of different reasons. One of the things we point to normally is all of the bats we have here in Maine. Most of the bats we have in the U.S. in general are insectivores. They eat bugs. And through eating bugs, they play a major ecological service by reducing the number of insect pests that are out there.
There are 8 species of bat in Maine. 5 of those stay here year-round, hibernating over the winter. These include big brown, little brown, tricolored, northern long-eared, and small-footed. There are 3 bat species that migrate, heading south for the winter. These include hoary, silver-haired, and eastern red. Some of these bats are rare, some stay in the forest. Only an expert would be able to tell some of them apart. But some of those bats tend to be right around you.
Big brown bat is known to hibernate in human dwellings. It's the largest of these 5 species, and so it can overwinter in a larger variety of places. But these other 4 are all normally what we think of as cave hibernators. So they will go into either a cave or a mine or some other sort of subterranean structure that's going to have relatively constant temperature, relatively high humidity, and that's where they're going to spend the winter in that hibernation state. When they're up here visiting us in the summertime, we think of these 2 species, the big brown and the little brown, as the ones that we normally see in and around our neighborhoods and the ones that are most commonly found in connection with human dwellings. And so these are the ones that you're likely to find in, your attic, your barn, your camp, etc. For reasons that we'll talk about in just a few minutes, the big brown bat is by far the most common bat that we have in Maine anymore. And I would imagine if we find some bats tonight, they will most likely be big browns. Used to be that little browns were quite a bit more common. Eastern small-footed bats are interesting. They're very commonly associated with rocky outcroppings and talus slopes. So whereas the big brown and little browns in the summertime will form their maternity colonies in your barn or in your attic, eastern small-footed bats are looking for these sort of geological features, and that's where they're living out that life phase. The northern long-eared bat is a tree bat. And we normally think of these guys as inhabiting cavities and especially crawling under loose, flaky bark on trees and forming their maternity colonies there. And then the last one is the tricolored bat, which is another bat that relies on forests and on trees for maternity colonies and maternal roosts. And then our 3 migratory species here, they're also what are sometimes referred to as tree bats because they have this habit of day roosting in the summertime just in the leaves and foliage of trees. So they don't necessarily crawl into a cavity or a cave or a crevice or anything like that. And again, these are the ones that are making these long distance movements down to the southeast of the U.S.
So you got it. 8 species of bats in Maine. 5 are hibernating bats, but only 2 of those are likely to hibernate in your eaves, the big brown and the little brown bats. 3 are likely to hibernate in caves or tunnels. 3 bats migrate. That group is generally referred to as tree bats because they roost in trees, not your attic in the summer. Dr. Eric Blumberg is filling us in on bats and their natural history, and then we're going to have to find some later in the show. And let's hope we do, because something has been going terribly wrong with bats. That is next. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, and at Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. In a few minutes, we're taking the show outside to find some bats. Dr. Eric Blumberg has brought some equipment that will actually let us hear the bats as they fly around our heads. All this equipment is new because there's a sudden need to study them. We've always had a lot of bats, but that was before millions were wiped out by a mysterious disease that apparently snuck over here from Europe. Right now, Dr. Blomberg is explaining it all to a small group at Fields Pond Audubon Center in Holden, just what went wrong.
So, by far, the largest conservation issue facing bats these days is this disease that we call white nose syndrome. This is a disease that affects cave hibernating bats, and since it has been introduced to this country just about a decade ago, the estimates, and this is probably an underestimate at this point, are in the neighborhood of 5 to 7 million bat deaths. And some of these populations have declined by upwards of 90 or 95%. So it's been really a very catastrophic disease outbreak, and it's termed white nose syndrome for this sort of white little patch that's growing around the nose on these infected bats. And if we flip to the next slide, I think, yeah. So the cause of white nose syndrome is a fungus that's superficially very similar to something like a bread mold. It's got this really long Latin name that I can never really pronounce very well. And what this is it's a fungus. It infects the bats. That white around the nose are the fruiting bodies of the fungus as it's coming out in the wintertime while the bats are hibernating. The fungus itself isn't necessarily lethal to the bats. What it does, though, is it's an irritant. It causes them to come out of hibernation in the winter. They're hibernating because they have very limited ability to store fat reserves. So that's the whole mechanism where they lower their heart rate and their body temperature, and they use very little energy over the winter because they don't have the capacity to feed because it's so cold, and they can't store fat because they're so small. And so when they wake up in the middle of the winter because of the irritation of this fungus, they very rapidly burn through any kind of energy reserves they have, and they die. And this has led to, again, 90% plus population declines of many different cave hibernating bats.
White nose syndrome first showed up in a cave in the Catskills in 2006. In 2010, it first showed up in Maine, in a cave in the Western Mountains. It's now all the way south along the Appalachians, and it's moved into the Midwest. Scientists had hoped that the prairies and mountains would keep the disease from spreading any farther west. But just this winter, we learned that an outbreak has been discovered in Washington state.
We have really 4 species of bats that have been most severely affected in Maine, 3 of which are now protected under our state Endangered Species Act. So the little brown and the northern long-eared are now state endangered under Maine's Endangered Species Act, and the eastern small-footed bat is listed as state threatened. The tricolored bat also probably has been widely affected by white nose, but it's one of the bats in the state that we know the least about, and so it's not listed at this point. And then the northern long-eared bat is federally protected as a threatened species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And all of this is 100% due to these catastrophic declines due to white nose syndrome.
I see the difference at my house. I used to have bats in the eaves. I used to have the bats snapping up all the mosquitoes at night in the yard. I don't now. Fortunately, it may be that we've bottomed out. Over 90% of our bats may have died off, but at some point, the remainder start to develop some immunity. European bats developed that immunity a long time ago. Dr. Aaron Blomberg's presentation took place at Fields Pond Audubon Center in Holden earlier this month. Just up the road from there, the current homestead has bats. In a few minutes, we're going to take the gear out there and listen to echolocation.
We're going to talk about bat echolocation and acoustic monitoring. And so bats use echolocation calls. All of our Maine bats do this. So far as I know, all bats in North America do this. There are some bats in, for example, Southeast Asia that are not insectivorous and that are diurnal. So the big fruit bats that if you watch like Indiana Jones or Crocodile Dundee, those are fruit bats that are out in the day in the tropics. They can see during the day. They don't necessarily hunt with echolocation, but some studies have actually shown that they do in fact use echolocation even though they're not navigating at night. So, point being, all bats echolocate. And what this amounts to is it's similar to sonar on a boat, and as bats are flying around, they're emitting very high frequency sounds. Those sounds are going out, they're bouncing off objects, and they're coming back to the bat, and the bat interprets those sounds to navigate, find food, avoid obstacles. I can hear echoes coming off of the room around me right now. I am echolocating in doing so. I don't have any sort of capacity to interpret that. So if I close my eyes, I couldn't say, oh, there's two light fixtures that run this way and the peak of the roof, whatnot. Bats have evolved to interpret those sounds and effectively do what amounts to a whole lot of subconscious trigonometry in their head, so that when they hear a sound come back and they know how long it took for that sound to get to them, they can judge distance, size, direction, rate of travel, all these different things. It's really pretty incredible.
It's incredible, yes, but there are two easier ways to understand it all. Really, it's not that much different than sonar. But second, it's not that different from our own human sight. Waves are always moving around. The lower frequencies are sound waves, the higher ones are in the visible spectrum of light. What we're seeing is light waves reflected off objects. The only difference is we're not making the light, except that if we took a flashlight outside, we would be. Bats have evolved to see everything through their ears.
And they have all sorts of interesting adaptations related to their morphology of their ears. When you see a bat with giant ears, those are essentially satellite dishes that are picking up these echolocations as they come in. They have all sorts of modifications to their brain and their ear bones that allow them to interpret these sounds, literally on the fly as they're going around in their nighttime environment.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. Different bats make different sounds. That's because different bats fly and feed differently. So if you could hear them, you could actually tell the bats apart. Give me a few moments and Dr. Eric Blomberg will explain. Then we'll take the equipment outside and hear it for ourselves. We're at Fields Pond Audubon Center in Holden. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8. Today's show is about bats, a flying mammal that we all know and often take for granted. But so far in the show, we've learned that there are actually 8 different species in Maine. 5 of them hibernate over the winter, 3 of them go south, 2 of them are likely to roost in your attic, and the rest are in caves, trees, or somewhere else. For species that hibernate in big groups, many have been wiped out by a highly infectious fungus called white nose syndrome. In a few more minutes, we'll be taking some unique equipment outdoors so that we can actually hear the bats and maybe see how many different species are actually swirling around us right here. Meanwhile, Dr. Eric Blomberg has been explaining echolocation, the sonar-type thing bats do at night so they can find their way around the dark and find food.
So the interesting thing about bat echolocations and the characteristics of those sounds is they really factor into how we can monitor bat populations. All bat echolocations occur in a frequency range that's typically above what people can hear. So they start at 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. Our bats here in Maine, the highest frequency bats are up at about 120, 130 kilohertz.
Well, there it is in a nutshell. The sounds that bats make and hear are maybe 6 times higher than humans can hear. We're not even close. So we can't just go out and listen for them. But what we can do is use specialized microphones and equipment that can pick up these sounds and translate them for us. And that's the key point. Lower frequencies are louder and travel farther. So if you're a bat out in a rather large space, maybe a forest, and you need to see a little further ahead, hear a little farther ahead, well, you might use a lower sound. If you're a bat in a relatively small space, maybe a backyard with flying insects all over the place, you may make a sound that is higher and faster so that you can get the signals back fast enough to maneuver after that mosquito. And that varies by species.
Well, when we're dealing with multiple different species of bats that have all evolved to exploit different niches in their environment, what they've essentially done is evolve to use sounds, echolocation sounds, that occur in different ranges and have different shapes to the calls. And that allows us to use this ultrasonic recording equipment to not only go out and say, yes, there are bats here, but also to make some interpretation of which species of bats are present in any given place. And I'll give you an example here. These are happening very rapidly, and so they're making a lot of calls very rapidly in a very short amount of time. And you can see this big brown bat, the bottom of the calls are occurring right at about 27 kilohertz. Whereas I've got a sonogram here of a little brown bat, which the bottom of the calls are occurring closer to 40 kilohertz. So there's a separation here between the two species, relates to the type of environments they normally forage in, allows us to interpret the difference between them based on the characteristics of their calls. It's actually going to tell us as we go, you just detected this kind of a bat. And for the most part, it's pretty decent. But there's a lot of subtleties. So just as different species of bats use different kinds of calls when they are in the sort of places they normally forage, individual bats will change the types of calls they use depending on if they're in, for example, a more open or a more cluttered environment.
So we've got a wildlife crisis, but we've also got some new tools. What's next? Well, our speaker is Dr. Eric Blomberg, and his fellow researcher is Sabrina Moreno. They've been partnering up to get some of this equipment into the field in many places around the state so we can get a better handle on what we have left for bats. It's even possible to get one of these bad boys into your hands for little bat surveying.
In conjunction with Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and also Maine Audubon, we've been developing an approach to collecting data on bats using citizen science volunteers and some of the equipment we're going to work with tonight. We've called this the BatMe project, which is a sort of a play on words of bats and Maine. And we got some pilot funding from Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund that purchased the detectors we're going to use this evening. What these are, they're an interesting setup where we've got a iPad tablet and an acoustic microphone that plugs into that tablet. The tablet has an app on it. That app is going to listen for calls, record calls, show us the sonogram outputs, going to translate the calls into an audible sound that we can hear, and it's going to give us its best guess as to what bat we're listening to. So it's kind of a nice piece of technology, and the whole approach to the project is we put together a kit that has the iPad, the microphone, and some other assorted gadgets to go with it, and then we can provide this to volunteers who can go out and survey for bats in their neighborhoods or in other areas they're interested in. And the app on the iPad, I just mentioned, allows us to do all these neat things, recording and visualizing the bat calls and translating them into things we can see. Importantly, though, it gives us a georeferenced location of where we detected the bat, so we have the actual coordinates. It gives the user a species identification, but it also stores and records the call. And so then we can download it off the device later, and we can do some more sophisticated processing of it to put it into our long-term database.
So we're going to take these mini iPads out into the field in a few minutes. We're at Fields Pond Audubon Center, and in a moment we'll head over to the Curran Homestead Museum, where we know there are bats in the eaves of at least one of the buildings. The question is, of the 8 species in Maine, which ones are down there?
The 2 that are showing up the highest here are the big browns and the silver-haireds. There's a good chance if we get into some big browns tonight that it's going to tell us we're hearing silver-haireds too. These 2 bats are the ones that are most similar to each other in terms of their calls, so they're the hardest to distinguish. So there's a good chance that this large bar saying we detected 1,427 recordings of silver-haireds last year, that a lot of those were probably big browns. But lots of examples of eastern red and hoary bats, and then these 4 species over here are the ones that are affected by white nose. So you can sort of see the distinction here between bat species that have not been affected by the disease versus those that have, which is what we would expect. And so if you're interested more in the citizen science project, as of now for this summer, we're more or less full up on volunteers relative to what we can handle with the equipment we have available. But if you want to, we do have a website. It's easy to remember, batme.org. There's a data form that you can find to participate where you can fill out a really quick form and get on a mailing list, and we'll definitely have more opportunities in future years as we increase the capacity of the project. So feel free to visit that site. And just have some folks to thank up at the top that have helped us with the project, and also funding sources. And if I didn't mention it clearly enough, we are partnered with Maine Audubon on this project. They've been a great collaborator so far.
And that is where we are, at Fields Pond Audubon Center in Holden. Dr. Eric Blomberg has been giving us the bat basics. And now it's time to go out and play with the gear. We're going to walk down the road across the Orrington line over to the Curran Homestead Museum, where one of the buildings definitely has bats. We're going to find out what this really sounds like and identify a bunch of bats by their hypersonic echoes. It'll take me about 3 minutes to get there. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Usually when this station is talking about bats, we're talking about the Red Sox. But this show goes outdoors in search of nature, adventure, and fun. And sometimes we find out stuff that we took for granted, but didn't really understand, like bats. They're all around us all summer. We don't see them very much because it's usually dark. They sweep some of the mosquitoes out of the yard and eliminate pests from our crops and forests. And they've been disappearing. Nearly gone. Dr. Eric Blomberg has just concluded a bat talk at Fields Pond Audubon Center, and we've walked down the road to the Curran Homestead. It's now a museum. At one time, this was a large farm property that dominated this part of Orrington. And it's got some old buildings, and one of those old buildings has bats, and we're here to listen to them. Now here's the situation. We're outside the building. It's dusk, or almost. The sun is actually just on the horizon. We have two special devices that will make the ultrasonic clicks of the bats audible to us. It'll sound a little like rapid chirping. These iPads have special microphones that detect the bat sounds, and the computer can interpret the frequencies and patterns to suggest what bat species we're actually hearing. Mostly what we're doing is standing around and swatting mosquitoes, which have just come out.
Here goes one.
It's a big bang. How do you? Something weird is. Yeah, so if you guys want to come and like look at the photos, see if you can see. There's a big bang. Oh, so that's
So you'll watch, they'll come pass out of here, and then we'll pick them up on here.
You can hear the chirping audio. All the computer is doing is capturing the bat noises and dropping the frequency into a range we can hear. Otherwise, what bats do is a whole lot of ultrasonic clicking.
Yeah, and so it's
telling me what's
identifying all these as big browns, and that seems about right.
Big brown bats. That's what most of these are, according to the iPad. And that is just about right, because most bats that currently roost in old buildings are big browns. Little brown bats used to do it too, but they have been nearly wiped out by the white-nosed fungus.
Yeah, I know. Oh, now it is.
The ones that are like hooking around the edge and going away.
It's fascinating. You can hear them coming. Now that we can hear their clicks and chirps, we can hear the approach, and there's enough daylight left in the gathering gloom to get a good look at the bats.
They start like probably about the time we started seeing them come out is when they started, and they'll just kind of keep. So they're coming out of probably a tiny little spot that can only fit a bat at a time. So
hoary bats are beautiful. They've got this really golden like collar around their heads, really puffy fur.
yeah, that's a hoary bat.
Can you pick it up? You got another one? There it is. Yep. What's up there flying? Oh my gosh, there's more.
Hoary bats. Until right now, I didn't know we had such a thing. And it's right over my head.
And that's pretty cool because now you can see them pretty well, but a lot of times you can just hear them with the detector, but you can't really quite see them so close because they're up a bit higher. Or you can kind of hear them approaching, so it's kind of neat. People really like being able to go out and kind of and then you get the ID right away.
We're all just standing around. Half of us are looking at one monitor, half of us are looking at the other, and half of us are looking for explanations, like, do bats really fly into your hair?
Well, I mean, if you give a bat a reason to go into your hair, I suppose. You know, the big thing, the other thing is always they get into people's houses, and the first reaction is to find a tennis racket. Mm-hmm. And probably the better thing to do is just to open the door of the house and let the bat find its own way out. There goes one right there.
Maybe it's because we're attracting mosquitoes, but it appears that we're attracting bats to eat the mosquitoes.
Wow. Yeah. Here comes another one. Oh, there it is.
Well, this is weird. A bat just came out from under the eaves, and it looks like it's carrying a smaller bat.
That's awesome. Baby. Great signal there too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my god. So the baby's on its back?
No, it's carrying it in its feet.
That's crazy.
And it looked like it might have just gone back in.
Yeah, that's what we saw. A mama bat flying with a baby bat. I've never seen it before, and I didn't even know they did that, or even that they could do that, since a baby is born at about a third the size of the mother. That's technically a lot of weight to carry while staying airborne.
I didn't know they did that.
Well, it's interesting because these bats you would think are just going to raise the pups for the whole maternity season right in this building. But bats like the northern long-eared bats that make their maternity roosts under the bark of trees, they'll actually move theirs around from time to time to new places. But I don't know why a big brown living in a house would feel any need to do that. Yeah. Have you ever seen that before, Caitlin?
I've seen them carry, but I don't know why. Because they'll carry them around and then take them right back where they were.
Show them the world.
I guess so. Like, this is how you be a bat.
Some sort of process.
Did you guys get a chance
Would you like to?
look at
Yes,
this?
thank you. Oh, sure.
Suddenly, one of the units declares the presence of an unusual bat. There were several bats we were expecting, and one that we were not.
Looks like an eastern red to me.
But I don't miss it. I tried it.
Is that uncommon?
What does it think it is?
It called it a tricolored.
Tricolored.
It's not high enough for a tricolored, is it?
I don't
Or are those the small-footeds that are like 45?
It's a small footed. That could be a tricolored. It's hard looking at like pulses. Like for tricolored, I like to look at it collapse with them all together, and if they're really even, it could be a tricolored. Yeah. I agree. Yeah, look how that's like hockey stick. That's a tricolored.
Cool.
That's really exciting. Yeah, we got a rare bat.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Will they mix with the other bats?
They will. Well, they will not roost together necessarily, but they will all forage in the same area.
Good job.
So that's another one that's hanging out in the trees, the tricolor? Or would that be inside the house?
They're rarely in houses. They'll be the ones that are like under bark.
Under bark.
Or in a cavity, and you kind of, hole in the
Good job.
tree.
I don't know that. I think.
So there it is. As the light fades, we're hearing more bats and seeing fewer. The eastern red bat is an unexpected treat. Altogether, during the half hour we've been standing out here, we've heard 4 different species. For more information, look up bats on the website of the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. They got a lot of information on there, and here are some tidbits from that site that might fill in some of the gaps. Like, why do bats fly so erratically? It's not just to catch insects in their mouths. When flying, a bat often scoops insects into its tail or wing membranes, and then transfers the insects to its mouth. Bats will fly from half a mile to 6 miles from their roost to a feeding site, using temporary roost sites there until returning to their main roost. So we know a lot of big brown bats are in the roost we're standing next to, but we have no idea where the other bats came from. Bats have few predators: hawks, owls, house cats, raccoons. Sometimes they can prey on them. Natural events include long winters and fierce storms during migration. Those can kill bats. Human activities, including habitat alteration, commercial pesticide use, control practices of pesticides, wind power development, those are major causes of mortality. Bats can die from direct exposure to pesticides or by eating sprayed insects. For their size, bats are the world's longest-lived mammals. According to records, one big brown bat lived in the wild for 19 years, and a little brown bat reached the age of 33. According to IFW, the safest way to view and enjoy bats is to watch them in action. Bats are fascinating flyers, zigzagging across the yard as they chase and eat insects. Little brown bats hunt over water. Big brown bats are often seen hunting along the margins of wooded areas, or silhouetted against the lighter sky as they twist and turn above the tree canopy. It's also fun to watch bats drink, which I've actually never seen. They usually do it first thing after leaving their day roost. They scoop up mouthfuls of water with their lower jaws as they fly over lakes and streams and ponds. Most bats do not come out to eat or drink in heavy rain or when the air temperature is below 50. If you want to make a bat house to use in Maine, paint it with multiple coats of flat, black exterior latex and put it where it's going to get the full sun. Maine bats want a home that bakes in the sun, a nice warm place to raise their young, one that doesn't require them to shiver to keep warm while roosting. Build a bat house or buy it, at least 2 feet tall and 14 or more inches wide. Bigger is better. A roughened or screen-covered landing platform measured 3 to 6 inches should extend below the house so they can get in easily. The house could be single-chambered or multi-chambered, but chambers should be 3/4 to 1 inch wide, including a variety in size, which will accommodate the different species. Now, the houses should be caulked during construction and preferably screwed rather than nailed. The idea is to create a really tight microclimate inside the house that'll both trap the heat of the day and also the warmth of the bats themselves. Now, put it in full sun, preferably on a pole. The next best location may be the southern side of a building in full sun. The temperature inside really has to be between 85 and 104 degrees. Don't put it in a tree, which is usually too shady, and that can be close to hawks and owl perch sites too. Now, I have a bat house myself, and it's never been used because I made all those mistakes. It's on the wrong side of the house where it gets mostly shade. Oh, and don't worry about adding a bat house to your property and worry that it's going to encourage bats to move into your attic or wall space. If the bats actually like your attic or wall space, they're probably already in there. I did have them in my wall spaces, but mine seemed to be among the colonies that died off. I miss them. Coming up, there's something new in the water. Isle au Haut Ferry has a new ferry. For them, it means more speed and more capacity. For you, it means more outdoor adventure in the waters of one of the most scenic places along the Maine coast. Now that they've got the boat, they're going to use it. We'll get the scoop in a moment. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is a show about outdoor fun and adventure, so I mention the Isle au Haut Ferry a lot. There's a bunch of unique things about it. Primarily, it's a non-profit company that was established to get people back and forth from Stonington to Isle au Haut, an island that is home to about 30 families year-round and about 300 people during the summer months. It also gets people back and forth to the southern half of the island, which is all part of Acadia National Park. They've been doing it with 2 boats, the Miss Lizzie and the Mink. Besides the ferry service, they also do some special trips now and then, including lighthouse tours and including trips out of Seal Island to visit the puffin colony that is there. I volunteer as official spotter for those puffin trips quite often. This summer, a new boat has been built by a family-owned company in Surrey called Westmac, and the boat should be coming online this weekend. Last weekend, I was out on the Mink, and on the way back in, I spent a few minutes with Captain Garrett Aldridge to learn more about the new boat named Otter. If this interview sounds a little noisy, it's because we're right up front and the engine is right beneath us. We've just pulled out of Isle au Haut and we're heading back towards Stonington Harbor. Well, here it goes. So changes are coming to the Isle au Haut Ferry sooner or later.
Yes, indeed.
You got a new boat. Tell me about it.
Okay, well, we talked to Westmac a little over a year ago about potentially building our new ferry. We were looking for something similar to what we have, a little bit wider, maybe carry a few more passengers, but with some speed, so we could, in case of an emergency, get from point A to point B. And also, we had our puffin trips in mind, or our lighthouse trips in mind, so we could speed through the distances that we're sort of, chugging along at normally, and have more time at the actual site to watch birds or talk about the lighthouses. So, for a few years, we have been kicking around this idea and trying to save some money, but it wasn't until about a little over a year and a half ago that the president of the company and I sort of just looked at the money situation, and a light bulb went off, and we realized we could probably afford a boat. So, with many thanks to George, our president, George Cole, he's the one who put all the funding together, really. And we started in looking at certain boat builders, but Westmac was always on the top of the list. And then when we got to talking to them, they were the only one who could fit us in the time schedule we were looking for. And that was it. That cinched it.
So what's the big difference between, let's say, the Mink that we're on now and the Otter, which is coming?
The Mink is roughly the same length. She's what you'd call a full displacement hull, which means it doesn't go fast. It sets in the water. It's built to be stable. And the mink was designed by my uncle Buster and my dad to some extent to be heavy, so she would be stable. No real thoughts of speed. The otter is not only a semi-displacement hull, which means she can get up and go if need be, but she's also 2 feet wider, which means she is more stable and has more room. So this boat holds 62 plus 2 crew, and otter hopefully will hold 78 plus 2 crew.
Yeah. And that one has an upper deck. This one is just on one level.
Yes, that's right. It has an upper deck. It's sort of a cross between the Mink and the Miss Lizzie. Miss Lizzie was our old girl that we had for a long time, and she was a beautiful boat, but she was costing too much money, but she had an upper deck and a forward deck, and we said, let's get at least the upper deck. People really love that, so we sort of smushed them together.
One of the problems with a new boat is it doesn't necessarily arrive when you expect it to, and there has to be expected and perhaps a little bit of delay, and that's what you had.
Yes. There's been a couple of months delay, but it's all good. We are running on a 1-boat schedule and still making all of our runs to Idaho for the most part. And Westmac is they're trying to build us the best boat they can build us, which is what they're doing, and it's an awesome boat. We couldn't be happier.
Yeah, I wasn't so much worried about the delay. I was really wondering how you were handling it with 1 boat, because you had 2. You're doing the exact same schedule you were doing before with 1.
Not quite. Not quite. We had to do away with the harbor cruise that we do in the summer, and we've done away with, I like to say, half a trip. One of our trips, we used to go to Duck Harbor and then come straight home. We now swing by Idaho and pick up on the way home, so it's roughly 1/2 of one of the trips we cut out. So we used to do 5 trips, we do 4.5 now.
But on the other hand, with the new boat, you're going to be able to squeeze in a lot more because it is faster.
Well, that's what everybody thinks. This speed costs money.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fuel to be burned to get to that speed, and unfortunately, it's probably not going to be worthwhile for us to run around at that speed all the time. Now, again, I reference that we will use it for emergencies and probably for times when we need to get from point A to point B a little bit quicker, like in our lighthouse trips and our puffin trips, but not every day. And there's so many days out of the year that you can't go wide open. It's too rough, and people are going to get beat up, and they're not going to enjoy it. So our 10-knot speed is probably going to stay.
One of the things I've been admiring about Idaho Ferry for the last few years is you're getting adventurous about what you're offering to the public. You didn't really used to do the puffin trips that I now go on all the time. You do more lighthouse tours, and we're thinking about even doing some winter stuff. So you're getting adventurous. Does this boat inspire you to do even more?
Absolutely, yeah. We're thrilled to have this boat because it's a beautiful boat. Number one, it's got the speed, it's got the size, the stability, so that we'll venture out even more. And we want to get this boat out and have people see it and enjoy it. So there's more to come, and we've got young people. I say young. I'm not as young as I used to be, but my co-manager Amanda Crow is fairly young in the game, and she's very excited about doing lots of things with this company. So good things to come.
What are you going to do with the old boat, the Mink? I mean, you had Miss Lizzie as a backup before. Is this going to be the backup?
So yeah, we will probably still use the Mink in the winter because she's proven herself. She's tried and true. Not that we would worry about otter in the winter, but we don't want to beat her up. That's the main point. Is I don't want to ruin this boat. It's a new boat. Let's keep it shiny and new for a long time. And this boat, the Mink is a very proven boat in the winter. So.
Well, that's good. I would hate to see the Mink go anywhere because I love this boat. I've been in a number of boats, and this one, as you say, is really stable.
Yes.
And it's comfortable for a lot of people. And that's unique among some of the boats along the coast.
Yeah, that was the one thing, again, harkening back to my uncle, Buster Aldridge. He really put a lot of emphasis in weight for stability, and so much so that they poured tons of concrete in the keel along with lead, which most boats don't have.
So Otter is going to be available later on during the course of the summer and fall?
Yes, we're hoping that she's going to come online somewhere in the first week of August. Yeah.
Great. And so anybody who has been thinking about coming out on Idaho Ferry has a treat waiting for them.
Yes, they do, absolutely. And, just because we're not going to use that speed all the time, we're still going to give her a little shot every now and again, so people get some enjoyment out of it.
Captain Garrett Aldrich, one of the captains and co-managers of the Idaho Ferry. This weekend's Puffin trip is also a lighthouse trip, so they'll be stopping at 3 lighthouse landmarks along the way. The Sunday trip leaves the dock at 11 a.m., so you've got time to make it. Coming up next weekend of the show, it was 50 years ago that Maine voters approved creation of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. There was a big celebration last weekend, and I was at Churchill Dam to take it all in. I'll share the adventure with you next weekend when Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine returns Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8. And remember, all shows are archived online at 929theticket.com. It's all brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Bar Harbor Whale Watch, Napa Auto Parts, EBS, and a Supercuts location near you. This is Sports Radio 929 The Ticket.